By sunrise, 3 houses were gone, the bridge had been carried 2 miles downstream, and Thomas Bishop's orchard stood in water nearly to the lower branches. They found his barn a 1/4 mile off its foundation. They found his wagon wedged in a fence line. They even found his wife's blue shawl tangled in a sycamore 1/2 mile downstream. They never found Eleanor, but 11 nights later, every firefly in the valley seemed to gather in the Bishop orchard, and they have gathered there every June since. Thomas and Eleanor Bishop had been married close to 15 years by the spring of the flood. Not newlyweds, and not by any account that survives them, a hard or unhappy pair. Neighbors who remembered them described a marriage that had simply settled into itself the way a good farmhouse settles. Nothing dramatic in it, nothing anyone would think to write down, just 2 people who worked well together and seemed, by all appearances, to actually like each other after all those years. They weren't wealthy. The farm was modest, the orchard behind it older than either of them, planted by whoever had settled the land a generation before. Apple trees, mostly, gone a little wild in their spacing the way old orchards do. Eleanor loved it in a way Thomas found faintly amusing and never quite understood. Every June, when the fireflies came up out of the grass at dusk, she'd take her supper out to one tree near the back of the orchard and sit beneath it until the light was gone entirely. Sometimes Thomas joined her once his chores were done. More often he didn't, and she never made him feel poorly about it, though she'd tease him some for coming in with dirt still under his nails when the fireflies were already up and he'd missed the best of it. A neighbor woman who used to trade preserves with Eleanor remembered stopping by one June evening and finding her sitting alone under that tree with a plate of cold supper balanced on her knees, perfectly content, in no hurry at all to come inside and eat it warm. When the neighbor asked why she didn't just wait for Thomas, Eleanor laughed and said something like, "He'll be along when he's along. This won't wait on either of us." "You ought to look at things while they're here," she told him once, more than once probably, in that easy way she had of saying something true without making it a lesson. Thomas laughed it off, the way a man does when he assumes there will always be another June to make up for the one he missed. He would come to regret assuming that. The rain that spring started ordinary enough, welcome even, after a dry stretch. Then it didn't stop. A day, 2 days. By the 3rd, the creek that ran below the Bishop place had climbed out of its banks and was still rising, and every family along it was moving livestock to higher ground as fast as they could manage. Thomas wanted Eleanor to go up with the neighbors while there was still time. She refused at first. There were still animals to move, and she wasn't the kind of woman who left work half-finished while there was daylight to finish it in. By the 3rd night, the water had come up over the lower pasture fence and was climbing the yard itself, and there wasn't room left for arguing about it. The plan, as much as there was one, split them apart. Thomas took the horses and what cattle he could manage toward the ridge road, driving them ahead of him through water already past his knees in places. Eleanor was to follow shortly after, riding up with a neighboring family already loading their own wagon nearby, no more than a few hundred yards off. It should have taken her 20 minutes. She never arrived at the ridge road. Nobody watched it happen. That's the part that made the not knowing so much harder to live with. There was no single terrible moment anyone could point to, no witness, no last sight of her being carried off. In the confusion of animals bolting and water rising faster than anyone had planned for, Eleanor simply wasn't where she was supposed to be anymore, and by the time anyone thought to look, there was no way left to look. The family she'd meant to ride up with carried the weight of that for the rest of their lives, though nobody ever blamed them for it, least of all Thomas. They'd assumed she was just behind them, same as she'd assumed she had a few more minutes to spare. By the time they realized she hadn't caught up, the water between their wagon and the Bishop place had already risen too high and too fast to cross back through. The husband tried anyway, on foot, and nearly didn't make it back himself. When the water finally fell, Thomas searched with an intensity that alarmed people who knew him as a careful, unhurried man. Neighbors combed the creek for miles downstream and found pieces of 6 farms scattered through the brush, fence rails, furniture, drowned livestock, clothing caught high in trees where the water had carried it. Men worked in pairs along both banks for the better part of 2 weeks, checking every log jam and sandbar the retreating water had left behind, calling Eleanor's name into the timber until their voices gave out. Then, half a mile down, someone found a length of blue cloth tangled in a sycamore, and Thomas knew it before he was close enough to be sure. Eleanor's shawl, the one she'd worn to church every Sunday for as long as anyone could remember. Everyone took it as the answer. She'd been swept downstream, same as the shawl, and the creek had simply never given her back the way it hadn't given back 2 other bodies from farms further up the valley that same spring. It was the kind of explanation that satisfied the valley well enough to let the search wind down, though a few of the older men, who'd fished that creek their whole lives, admitted privately that they'd never known it to keep a body it wanted to give back, and never known it to give back one it truly wanted to keep either. Thomas kept searching long after the other men went back to their own rebuilding. He walked the creek bank for weeks after anyone else had stopped, turning over driftwood, checking every sandbar the water had left behind. What if she'd survived, he kept thinking, though he never said it out loud to anyone. What if she'd been carried somewhere and was hurt, or lost, or simply hadn't found her way back yet? It was a thought with no evidence behind it and no way to kill it either, and it followed him through that entire ruined summer. More than once in the years that followed, word reached him of a woman answering some rough description of Eleanor, seen in a town 2 counties over, or taken in by a family further south, who'd found her wandering and confused after the flood. Thomas rode out after every one of those reports himself, no matter the distance, no matter how thin the details. Every time it came to nothing, a stranger who happened to share a name, or a story that fell apart the closer he got to it. He stopped telling people when he went, after a while. It was easier than explaining, each time, why he still believed it was worth the ride. If stories like this find you on the road home, subscribe and ride along. New stories every week, waiting at the trailhead. 11 nights after the flood, Thomas was sitting outside what was left of the house when he noticed light moving in the orchard. A few fireflies at first, nothing strange in that, not in June. Then more. Then, by his own later account, more than he had ever seen gathered in one place in all his years on that farm. And instead of spreading loose through the trees the way fireflies always had, they were pulling together into one dense, drifting mass around a single tree at the back of the orchard. Eleanor's tree. Thomas walked out toward it. As he got close, the light seemed to part just enough for him to see something pale on the ground beneath the lowest branches. He knelt down and found Eleanor's hair comb lying in the grass, half covered by leaves, as though it had been there for days. It shouldn't have been. The comb belonged inside the house, in the small dish on her dresser where she kept it every night of their marriage. The house had taken water, but not so much that the bedroom furniture was lost. The dresser itself was still standing when Thomas got back to it, the dish still sitting where it always had, her hairpins and a small glass bottle of scent both still exactly in place, only the comb was gone. There was no obvious way it alone could have washed all the way out to that particular tree while everything around it stayed put, and no way to know if it had come with the floodwater at all or been dropped there earlier and simply never noticed until the fireflies gathered close enough to show it to him. Thomas turned it over in his hands for a long time before he carried it back inside. Nobody had an answer for how it got there. Nobody ever would. Thomas kept the comb on him for a while after that, carrying it in his coat pocket the way another man might carry a coin for luck, before he finally set it back in the little dish on Eleanor's dresser where it had always belonged. He told himself, and later told other people, that it must have simply been overlooked in the wreckage and carried out by the flood same as everything else, though he never had a good answer for why nothing else on that same dresser had gone anywhere at all. He said it plainly enough that most people believed he believed it. Whether he actually did was a different question, one nobody who knew him well enough to ask ever quite worked up the nerve to. After that, Thomas went out to the orchard every evening the fireflies were up. They gathered the same way each night, thick and concentrated around Eleanor's tree, rather than scattered loose through the grass, the way fireflies behaved everywhere else in that valley. When June ended, they thinned out and disappeared the way fireflies always had, and Thomas spent the rest of that year rebuilding what the flood had taken, same as everyone else along the creek. Thomas never remarried. Whether that was because he still expected Eleanor to return, or simply because he'd already had the marriage he wanted, nobody ever knew. He kept the house much as Eleanor had kept it, her dresser in its place, the small dish where her comb had always sat now holding the comb he'd carried back from beneath the tree. People who visited him over the decades said the house never quite felt empty, exactly, though they couldn't always say why. The following June they came back. Same tree, same dense gathered light, nothing like the ordinary scatter you'd see in any other orchard or field for miles around. By then neighbors had started walking out in the evenings to see it for themselves. Word travels slow, and then all at once in a valley that size, and soon enough people were making a habit of it, the way people make a habit of watching a sunset that happens to be unusually fine. Most offered plain explanations. Maybe the tree gave off something that drew insects better than the others around it. Maybe the ground held moisture in a way that suited them. Nothing about a gathering of fireflies needed to be strange on its own. Except fireflies came up everywhere in that valley every June, and nowhere else did they behave like this. Nobody had ever tried to make them gather there, and nobody could explain why they kept doing it. A school teacher who boarded nearby for a time tried counting them one summer, standing at the edge of the orchard with a lantern of her own and a scrap of paper, and gave it up within the hour, admitting there were simply too many, moving too fast, to arrive at any honest number. She told people afterward that she'd never seen anything like it in any other orchard she'd passed through, before or since. A traveling preacher who stopped through one June, hearing the story secondhand, walked out to see the orchard for himself and offered his own theory to anyone who'd listen, that the ground there had simply been made holy by what had happened to it, and the insects knew it the way animals sometimes know things people don't. Most of the valley shrugged that off as readily as they shrugged off the moisture theory and the tree sap theory before it. Nobody had proof of any of it. Nobody needed proof to keep coming out to look. Years passed that way. Thomas kept searching the creek banks whenever a new flood or a hard rain exposed fresh ground, the old habit never quite leaving him even after most people had long since stopped expecting anything to turn up. It was an older neighbor, watching him from the porch one June evening as the fireflies gathered thick around the tree, who finally asked him plainly whether he still believed his wife was somewhere in that river. Thomas looked out at the light for a while before he answered. "No," he said. "Where then?" "I don't know," Thomas told him, and left it there. It was the kind of answer that satisfied nobody, including by every account Thomas himself. But it was the truest one he had. The orchard changed as the years went on, the way orchards do. Trees died off one by one, some to age, some to storms that took whole rows at once. Eventually, Eleanor's tree began dying too, the bark going gray and papery, fewer apples every season, until there were none at all. People told Thomas, gently at first and then less gently as it leaned further and further with every wind, that it was dangerous and ought to come down. He refused every time he was asked. By then he was an old man himself, stooped and slow in the way the whole valley had gotten used to seeing him, but stubborn as ever about that one tree. One summer, a younger relative, more concerned with practicality than with whatever the tree meant to Thomas, tried clearing the brush and long grass from around its base without asking, thinking a cleaner, drier patch of ground might at least discourage the insects from massing quite so thick if the old man wouldn't let the tree itself come down. The fireflies gathered just as thick that June as they ever had, over bare dirt as easily as they had over grass, and the young man never tried anything like it again. One winter, a storm took the decision away from Thomas entirely. The tree fell in the night, and Thomas found it in the morning, lying across the ground it had stood over for longer than he'd been alive. People said it hit him harder than the flood itself had, though nobody could say for certain whether that was true or just the kind of thing people like to say about an old man and his dead wife's tree. Everyone assumed, with the tree gone, the fireflies would finally stop. That June, they didn't. They came back to the orchard the same as always, in the same dense, gathered mass, except now there was no tree to gather around, just thousands of lights hovering above an empty patch of ground where the tree used to stand, as if whatever had drawn them there all those years had nothing to do with the tree at all. It was sometime in that same stretch of years, while repairing a loose board behind the kitchen shelf, that Thomas found a slip of paper tucked where it must have sat undisturbed since long before the flood. Eleanor's handwriting, plain and unhurried, a note she'd left him once for some ordinary reason neither of them would have thought worth remembering. A reminder about the harvest, nothing more. Apples needing picked before a rain she must have seen coming that week, and nothing else on the page but his name at the top the way she always wrote it. Thomas sat with that scrap of paper longer than a man might reasonably sit with a grocery list. For decades by then, the valley had turned Eleanor into something close to a story. The woman who vanished in the flood, the reason for the lights in the orchard, a name people said with a certain careful hush. Holding that note, Thomas remembered, for a while, that she had also been a woman who worried about weather and apples and got after him for tracking mud through a kitchen she'd just swept. He kept the note in his coat pocket for the rest of that summer, the same way he'd once carried the comb, and never told anyone what was written on it. Thomas was very old by his last June. His hands had gone unsteady, and he'd taken to using a cane on the walk out to the orchard that had once cost him nothing at all. Late in the evening, he walked out to the orchard one final time and sat down where the tree had once stood. The fireflies gathered around him the way they always had around the tree, not landing on him, not touching him, just filling the air close around the clearing while he sat there in the near dark. A young woman staying at the house that summer, a relation of some kind by then, watched him from the porch and said afterward that she'd never seen so many gathered at once, thick enough in places to read by if a person had thought to bring something to read. She said it looked less like insects and more like something poured slowly out over the ground and left to settle. She said, too, that he stayed out there for hours, not moving, not doing anything but sitting in the middle of all that light. When he finally came back inside, he said only, "I finally looked." Nobody who heard it needed it explained. Everyone in that valley had heard, at some point over the years, the story of the woman who used to tell her husband to look at things while they were still here to be looked at. Thomas Bishop had spent the better part of his life working and searching and trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. It took him most of it to finally just sit still and see what his wife had loved. He died before the year was out, not dramatically, just age, the way most of that generation went. The Bishop farm passed out of the family within a generation after that. The orchard, without anyone left to tend it, went the way neglected orchards go. Trees came down in storms and were never replaced. The house eventually fell in on itself, and the creek, over the decades, shifted its course enough that there's little left now to mark where the farm ever stood. But every June, when the nights turn warm, people who still walk that stretch of hillside say the fireflies gather the same way they always have, over the same patch of empty ground. No apple tree left standing, no house, no Eleanor, no Thomas. Just light, gathered in the same place it has gathered every June for longer than anyone living can account for. People below the old Bishop place eventually stopped asking whether Eleanor had died in that flood. There wasn't really anyone left who could answer it one way or the other. The creek had long since changed its own course, and nothing about the ground itself explained why that one patch of hillside still drew light out of the dark every June, while the rest of the valley didn't. Some people say the ground there simply suits them, same as the school teacher and the preacher and every other visitor had guessed at, one way or another, for the better part of a century. Others still repeat the old line about holy ground, though fewer of them mean it as literally as the traveling preacher once had. A few just say it's always been that way, as far back as anyone remembers, and leave it there, the way people leave most things in that country that don't have a tidy answer waiting at the end of them. Thomas Bishop believed the plainest version of it, or told people he did. But after Eleanor disappeared, he never missed another June.